Picture a scene of almost unimaginable opulence, a grand ballroom dripping with gold leaf, the air thick with the scent of 1,000 rare orchids and the finest French perfume. Women swathed in silk and diamonds glide across polished floors, their laughter mingling with the strains of a hidden orchestra. This was the Gilded Age in all its glory, a world built on colossal fortunes and even more colossal displays of wealth, a glittering stage where the only rule was to see and be seen. To be born into this world was to win the ultimate lottery of life, handed a script written in gold and guaranteed a future of limitless comfort and influence. But what happens when someone handed that golden ticket decides to tear it up? What kind of person looks upon a life of guaranteed luxury and chooses, deliberately and with clear eyes, to walk away from it all? This is not a story of a sudden downfall or a fortune lost to misfortune. This is the astonishing, scandalous true story of an heiress who possessed everything the world tells us to chase: money, status, power, and who made the conscious, radical decision to give it all away. She didn't just donate a portion. She systematically dismantled her own inheritance, redirecting a river of wealth away from the gilded ballrooms and into the hands of the struggling, the sick, and the forgotten. In an era obsessed with accumulation, she chose redistribution. In a society that worshipped status, she sought anonymity. Her life became a quiet rebellion against the very world that created her, a deliberate act that shocked her family, baffled high society, and created a legacy far more enduring than any diamond necklace or sprawling estate ever could. So, how does someone arrive at such a profound crossroads? What vision of a meaningful life could possibly outweigh the siren song of immense wealth and privilege? The journey we are about to embark on is more than a simple biography. It is an exploration of a conscience, a deep dive into the heart of a woman who looked at the world she inherited and decided to build a better one, no matter the personal cost. We will uncover the motivations behind her breathtaking philanthropy, navigate the swirling scandals her choices provoked, and trace the remarkable ripple effects of a single life lived defiantly, courageously, against the grain. This is a tale that challenges our deepest assumptions about money, purpose, and what it truly means to leave a mark on the world. To understand the sheer magnitude of her choice, we must first fully appreciate the world she was born to leave behind. Our story begins not in a simple home, but within the rarefied air of America's Gilded Age aristocracy, a class so wealthy and so insular, it operated as a nation unto itself. This was the world of the Vanderbilts, the Astors, and the Rockefellers families whose fortunes were so vast, they literally reshaped the American landscape. And into one such dynasty, our heiress was born. Her cradle was, in all likelihood, carved from the finest imported wood and lined with silk. Her first lullabies were the distant hum of a household staff, numbering in the dozens. From her earliest moments, her life was enveloped in a cocoon of almost unimaginable privilege, a world where money was not merely present, but was the very atmosphere one breathed, an invisible force that dictated every possibility and insulated against every ordinary hardship. Consider the physical stage for this life: the families, cottages in Newport, Rhode Island, which were in reality monumental marble palaces built to rival European castles, and their opulent Fifth Avenue mansions in New York City, which stood as fortresses of taste, and exclusion. These were not merely homes. They were potent symbols of social standing, designed to intimidate and impress. Inside, every detail was meticulously curated to proclaim their status. Walls paneled in rare woods, ceilings adorned with frescoes by master artists, and galleries filled with old master paintings acquired on grand European tours. The heiress would have learned to walk on priceless Persian rugs and played in rooms where a single piece of gilded furniture cost more than an average family's home. This was her normal, a landscape of such consistent magnificence that its sheer scale would have been utterly unremarkable to her young eyes. The social calendar that governed her family's life was a relentless, glittering carousel of prescribed events. There were the operas where one was required to be seen in a private box, the endless rounds of formal teas and calls, and most spectacularly, the costume balls that could cost upwards of $250,000 in today's money. At one legendary party, guests rode on real elephants brought in for the occasion. At another, the host's daughter emerged from a giant pie. For a young woman in this world, life was a performance, and her role was to be beautiful, accomplished, and ultimately compliant. Her expected path was clearly mapped out from infancy. A dazzling debutante ball to formally present her to society. A strategic marriage to a scion of an equally powerful family to consolidate fortunes and social standing. And then a life dedicated to managing her own household, producing heirs, and perpetuating the cycle of wealth and influence. Personal desire or intellectual ambition were secondary considerations, often brushed aside in the relentless pursuit of maintaining and enhancing the family's position. Beneath all the glitter and gold, however, ran a powerful undercurrent of rigid, unspoken rules. Society was governed by an intricate code of conduct known as the Misses. A store's 400, a definitive list of those who truly mattered. To be excluded was social death. To be included meant adhering to a stifling conformity. Conversation was carefully policed. One discussed art, music, and travel, but never the source of the family fortune, which often rested on the brutal realities of railroads, steel, or oil. One certainly never acknowledged the suffering of the millions whose labor built these empires. The factory workers and immigrants who lived in a different universe, just a few blocks away from the grand avenues. For a sensitive and observant child growing up in this gilded cage, the contradictions must have been increasingly difficult to ignore. The immense wealth was presented as a virtue, a sign of divine favor and superior breeding, but it created a life that was as predictable as it was luxurious, a beautiful, golden road with very few turns and no real destination of her own choosing. It was this profound disconnect between the outer splendor and the inner emptiness that would eventually plant the seeds of a magnificent rebellion. And so, into this world of extravagant fantasy and suffocating rules, a girl named Alva Vanderbilt was born on a winter's day in the middle of the 19th century. She did not enter the world as a Vanderbilt, however, but as Alva Erskine Smith, the daughter of a well-to-do Southern cotton broker and plantation owner. Her early childhood was one of comfort, but it was a comfort brutally shattered by the Civil War, which wiped out her family's fortune and forced them into a nomadic existence in the North. This early taste of financial instability and social displacement was a formative shock, planting in her a fierce determination that would later define her character. She was not coddled from life's harsher realities from the very beginning. She witnessed the dramatic fall from grace, an experience utterly foreign to most of her future peers, who knew only the relentless ascent of their family's wealth. By her late teens, Alva's family had managed to regain a foothold in New York society, and it was here that the young woman began to reveal the formidable personality that lay beneath the surface of a proper society debutante. She was not a docile, pliable young woman content to simply follow the script. Contemporaries described her as fiercely intelligent, possessed of a sharp wit, and blessed with an almost preternatural self-confidence that some mistook for simple arrogance. She had strong opinions on everything from architecture to women's education, and she was not afraid to voice them, a trait that was often discouraged in young women of her station, who were expected to be decorative and agreeable above all else. This was not a spirit that would be easily contained within the drawing rooms of Fifth Avenue. Her marriage to William Kissam Vanderbilt, grandson of the legendary Commodore Vanderbilt, was the strategic alliance her family had hoped for. It was a union that injected new money, Smith's social standing with the staggering, almost unimaginable wealth of the Vanderbilt Railroad empire. On the surface, Alva had achieved the ultimate Gilded Age dream. She was now one of the richest women in the world, her every material desire instantly fulfillable. Yet, even as she embarked on building the most opulent homes America had ever seen, like the breathtaking marble house in Newport, there were clear signs that she had no intention of being a passive ornament to her husband's fortune. She immersed herself in the details of architecture and interior design, not as a hobbyist, but as a master planner, working closely with the most celebrated architects of the day. She was not just spending money, she was building a personal kingdom, asserting her own taste and will upon the world in granite and gold leaf. This drive to create, to control, to do rather than simply be, was the first loud hint of the revolutionary spirit that would later consume her entire life. The rebellious girl who had seen her family's fortune vanish was now a woman intent on building something so solid and spectacular that it could never be taken away. But her definition of what was worth building was about to undergo a radical and beautiful transformation. But to truly understand the scale of Alva's future rebellion, we need to look more closely at the kind of education she received, because her schooling was anything but conventional for a Gilded Age heiress. While most young women of her station were being tutored primarily in the decorative arts, French, embroidery, piano, and the intricate rules of etiquette, Alva's mind was being forged in a very different fire. Her family, particularly her mother, believed in a surprisingly robust and intellectual education for a girl. She wasn't just learning to be a charming hostess. She was immersed in history, literature, and philosophy, subjects typically reserved for boys being groomed for leadership. This was highly unusual and critically important. It gave her the intellectual tools to analyze her world, not just accept it. She was taught to think, to question, and to form her own opinions, a dangerous thing to teach a woman destined for a life of silent compliance. This intellectual foundation was then broadened by extensive travel throughout Europe during her teenage years. This wasn't the typical grand tour, where wealthy Americans simply collected art and social connections. For Alva, it was a transformative immersion in history and culture. She walked through the ruins of ancient Rome, stood in the great cathedrals of France and studied the architectural marvels of the Renaissance. This exposure did more than cultivate her taste. It gave her a profound sense of historical context. She saw the rise and fall of empires, the fleeting nature of power built on mere wealth. It planted a crucial idea in her mind that true legacy was not about amassing things, but about creating something that would endure, something that contributed to the long arc of human progress. Perhaps most importantly, her European travels, combined with her own family's financial collapse after the Civil War, exposed her to the stark realities of social inequality in a way that was impossible to ignore from inside a New York mansion. In the industrial cities of England and on the streets of Paris, she witnessed firsthand the brutal conditions of the working poor, the overcrowded tenements, the child laborers, the palpable desperation that existed just a stone's throw from opulent boulevards. This was not an abstract concept in a newspaper. It was a visceral, human reality. For a young woman with a keen intellect and a developing conscience, these sights were deeply unsettling. They created a powerful cognitive dissonance with the world of excess she was about to enter. She began to understand that the immense wealth of families like her own was not created in a vacuum. It was inextricably linked to the labor and suffering of countless unseen others. This unconventional education, both academic and experiential, equipped Alva with something far more valuable than a fortune: a critical perspective. She returned to New York not as a wide-eyed debutante ready to be absorbed into the social machine, but as a young woman who had seen the world and understood its complexities. She carried with her the seeds of a radical idea that her vast inheritance was not just a personal privilege, but a profound responsibility. The glittering world of balls and mansions now felt strangely small and insular to her. She had developed a worldview, a framework through which she could judge the society she was born into, and she was finding it deeply wanting. This intellectual and moral awakening, fostered by her unique upbringing, was the essential precondition for everything that followed. It gave her the courage to eventually ask the most dangerous question of all. If this immense wealth and power was hers to command, what would she, Alva Vanderbilt, a woman who could think for herself, actually choose to do with it? And so the machinery of high society began to turn, setting in motion the one event every young woman of her class was conditioned to anticipate from childhood: her debut. For most, this was the culmination of their entire upbringing, the singular moment they were presented to the world not as a child, but as a marriageable commodity, their value assessed in a single, glittering evening. The pressure was immense and unrelenting. A successful debut could secure a brilliant marriage and a lifetime of influence. A failure could relegate a girl and her entire family to the outer darkness of social oblivion. For a woman of Alva's formidable intellect and burgeoning independent spirit, this ritual must have felt like a peculiar form of psychological torment. The entire process was designed to strip away individuality and present a polished, identical product. She would have been rigorously coached for months on the precise angle of a curtsy, the exact pressure of a handshake, the art of making innocuous, flattering small talk for hours on end. Every detail, from the shade of her gown to the flowers in her hair, was a calculated message about her family's wealth and her own suitability for a dynastic union. Her family's ambitions for her were clear and uncompromising. They had clawed their way back from financial ruin, and Alva's debut was their grand gambit to cement their restored status. In their eyes, her marriage was not about romance or personal fulfillment. It was a strategic merger, a business transaction of the highest order designed to ally their name with one of the truly colossal fortunes of the age. Her personal feelings were, at best, a secondary consideration. She was the key that would unlock the door to the innermost sanctum of American aristocracy. One can only imagine the dinner table conversations, the not-so-subtle reminders of her duty, the constant inventory of eligible bachelors discussed not for their character, but for their lineage and the depth of their coffers. The weight of her entire family's future aspirations rested directly upon her young shoulders. Yet, internally, a very different conversation was likely taking place. The young woman who had studied Roman history and walked through the great capitals of Europe could not have been wholly captivated by the prospect of spending an evening judging the cut of 100 identical ball gowns. Her own growing convictions, forged by her unconventional education, must have rebelled against the sheer absurdity of it all. Here she was, being groomed to auction herself off to the highest bidder, while her mind was filled with visions of art, architecture, and the stark social inequalities she had witnessed. The cognitive dissonance would have been deafening. How could one reconcile the mission of acquiring a husband who represented the pinnacle of unearned wealth with the gnawing knowledge of the human cost that underpinned that very fortune? The rituals of the debutante season were a celebration of everything she was beginning to question: the cult of wealth, the performance of status, the passive role assigned to women. This internal conflict did not manifest as a timid hesitation, but rather as a subtle, steely determination to bend the process to her own will. Alva would play the game, but she would play it by her own rules. Her debut, when it came, was likely executed with a precision and a flair that hinted at the master strategist she would become. She understood the assignment perfectly: to be seen as the most dazzling, the most desirable, the most brilliantly accomplished young woman of her season. But for her, this was not about winning approval. It was about accumulating social capital, a currency she intuitively understood she would need for her own, far grander projects. She was not simply a prize to be won. She was a player assessing the board, understanding that a strategic marriage could provide her with the platform and the resources to eventually transcend the very world that now sought to confine her. The debutante's dilemma, then, was not whether to comply, but how to harness the immense power of the system she was being forced to enter, turning a ritual of submission into the first step of a brilliant, lifelong campaign. The rituals of high society, for all their glittering intensity, could not fully insulate Alva from the city that sprawled beyond her marble walls. There came a point, a series of moments rather than a single event, where the carefully constructed facade of her world developed hairline cracks, allowing a very different reality to seep in. These were not formal, sanitized charitable visits organized by her peers, which often amounted to little more than fashionable poverty tourism. For Alva, the awakening was more direct, more visceral. It likely began with the simple, unavoidable act of travel. Her carriage, a rolling palace of velvet and polished wood, would have to navigate the same streets as horse-drawn carts in overcrowded omnibuses. Through her window, the scene would shift with jarring abruptness. One moment, the grand tree-lined calm of Fifth Avenue. The next, the cacophonous, teeming chaos of the Lower East Side. She would have seen, not as a statistic in a report, but as a living, breathing tableau, the human cost of the industrial machine that fueled her family's fortune. The air, thick with the smell of coal smoke and uncollected garbage, was a stark contrast to the perfumed drawing rooms she had just left. She saw children, their faces smudged with dirt, playing in gutters alongside piles of rotting refuse, their thin frames clad in little more than rags. She observed women, their shoulders stooped with a fatigue she had never known, hauling water up multiple flights of rickety stairs or hunched over piecework in dimly lit tenement rooms. These were not abstract, poor people. They were individuals with weary eyes and stories she could only imagine, living their lives in shocking, desperate proximity to her own absurd luxury. This visual assault was almost certainly compounded by a rising tide of public awareness. The Gilded Age was also the dawn of crusading journalism, a period where muckraking reporters like Jacob Riis used the new technology of flash photography to document what words alone could not fully convey. Riis's seminal work, How the Other Half Lives, published in 1890, was a sensation. Its graphic photographs and unflinching prose laid bare the horrifying conditions of New York's tenement slums. The dark, airless rooms where entire families were crammed together, the rampant disease, the overwhelming sense of human beings ground down by a system that offered them no escape. It is almost impossible to believe that a woman of Alva's intellect and curiosity would not have encountered this book. To see those photographs, the image of Bandit's Roost with its narrow alley and menacing figures, or the heart-rending sight of children sleeping in a dirt cellar, would have been to receive a report from a front line she had only glimpsed from her carriage window. It gave a name and a terrifying scale to the suffering she had sensed. Perhaps the most profound catalyst, however, was her own experience as a woman in a man's world. While her privilege was immense, it did not fully shield her from the legal and social constraints placed upon her gender. She owned no property in her own right. Everything was her husband's. She had no direct political voice. Women could not vote. She lived a life of extreme material comfort, but she was still, in the eyes of the law and society, a dependent. This personal understanding of a kind of powerlessness, however gilded, may have created a flicker of empathy, a bridge of understanding across the vast chasm of class. She could grasp, in a way a man of her station might not, what it felt like to have your fate and your potential limited by forces beyond your control. The working-class woman in the tenement was trapped by poverty. Alva Vanderbilt was trapped by expectation and law. They were different prisons, but they were both prisons. These cumulative experiences, the jarring visual contrasts, the documentary evidence of reformers, and her own nuanced understanding of constraint, coalesced into a moral crisis that her life of parties and palace building could not resolve. The cognitive dissonance became unbearable. How could she justify spending $300,000 on a single ball, a sum that could have housed and fed thousands of those tenement families for a year, when she now knew with chilling clarity what that money truly represented in human terms? The immense fortune she commanded was not abstract. It was directly connected to the labor of the very people living in those squalid conditions. The railroads that built Marble House were built by underpaid, overworked laborers. The entire Gilded Age economy was a pyramid, and she was at the glittering apex, supported by an invisible foundation of human toil. To recognize this was to understand that her wealth was not merely a blessing, but a weighty responsibility. The insulation of her world, you had been permanently shattered, replaced by a searing, uncomfortable, and ultimately transformative sense of duty. The heiress had looked upon another world, and she could not unsee it. The first signs of her rebellion were not grand, public gestures, but quiet, deliberate acts that must have felt like a secret life, running parallel to her official one as a society wife. While she continued to fulfill her duties hosting dinners, attending the opera, managing the sprawling households, a portion of her mind and a growing share of her resources were being stealthily diverted. It began with her personal allowance, a sum that would have been a fortune to anyone else. This was not money she needed for gowns or jewels. Those were accounted for separately. This was her discretionary fund, and she began to funnel it, with meticulous care, toward causes that would have made her family blanch. She didn't just write checks to the anonymous, faceless charity balls that were a staple of the social calendar. Instead, she sought out specific, often gritty, initiatives. She supported nascent settlement houses like the Henry Street Settlement, places where educated women lived among the poor to provide education, health care, and a sense of community. This was a radical concept. In funding, it was a direct, albeit quiet, endorsement of its philosophy. Her philanthropy soon evolved beyond mere financial support. She began to volunteer her time, a concept so alien to her social set, it was almost incomprehensible. While other society women might make a brief, ceremonial visit to a charitable institution, Alva went to work. She would arrive without fanfare, often leaving her carriage a few blocks away to avoid drawing attention. She didn't just observe, she rolled up her sleeves. There are accounts, carefully guarded at the time, of her reading to children in settlement house nurseries. Her elegant diction, a stark contrast to the tenement accents around her. She would listen for hours to the struggles of immigrant mothers, hearing firsthand about the tyrannical landlords, the unsafe factory conditions, and the desperate fight to keep their families fed and healthy. This was not poverty tourism, it was an education. She was gathering data, building a visceral understanding of the systemic problems that her class preferred to ignore. In those crowded, noisy rooms, surrounded by the raw evidence of inequality, the abstract principles of her European education were forged into a steel-hard resolve. Perhaps the most daring of these early acts was her quiet but firm support for the burgeoning labor movement and for progressive social reforms. While her husband's fortune was built on railroads and industries frequently accused of exploiting workers, Alva began to express sympathy for the very unions that were organizing against them. She would engage in heated discussions at dinner parties, defending the right of workers to organize for better wages and safer conditions, a position that was nothing short of treasonous within her circle. She also became an early and vocal advocate for tenement reform, publicly aligning herself with activists who were pushing for new laws to mandate windows, running water, and fire escapes in the slums. This was a direct attack on the property interests of many of her own friends and relatives, who owned the very tenement buildings being condemned. Her support wasn't always publicized, but in the whispers of drawing rooms and the pages of society columns, her name became associated with these controversial, unladylike causes. It was a social risk of the highest order, a deliberate fraying of the very threads that held her place in society intact. The reaction from her family and peers was a potent mixture of confusion, disdain, and outright alarm. To them, her behavior was a baffling breach of protocol. Charity was supposed to be a performance of noblesse oblige, a graceful bestowing of favors from on high that ultimately reinforced the existing social hierarchy. What Alva was doing was different. By volunteering, by listening, by advocating for systemic change, she was implicitly acknowledging a shared humanity with the poor and a flaw in the system that benefited her. This was deeply threatening. Her husband, William, likely saw it as an embarrassing distraction, a hobby that was morphing into an obsession and potentially damaging his business relationships. Her social circle began to talk, their invitations perhaps becoming slightly less frequent, their greetings tinged with a new, cold formality. She was becoming unpredictable, a woman with ideas of her own, and in a world built on conformity that made her dangerous. Yet for Alva, this growing isolation may have been a price she was willing to pay. Each act of defiance, each quiet donation, each hour spent in a settlement house was a brick in a new foundation she was building for herself, a foundation not of marble and gold, but of purpose and principle. The heiress was slowly, methodically buying her own freedom, not with money, but with acts of conscience. The backlash, when it came, was not a single thunderclap, but a rolling, continuous storm of outrage that began within the plush confines of her own home and radiated outward to poison the very air of high society. The first and most volatile front opened in the Vanderbilt mansion itself, where Alva's growing philanthropic commitments became a source of bitter, escalating conflict with her husband, William. For him, a man whose entire identity was built on the preservation and expansion of the family fortune, Alva's actions were not just eccentric. They were a direct assault on the Vanderbilt name. Their arguments, once confined to debates over architectural details, now exploded into full-blown confrontations over the family ledger. He saw her donations to tenement reform and labor advocacy not as charity, but as a form of corporate sabotage, a funding of the very forces that organized strikes against his railroads and factories. How could she sit across from him at the dinner table? He must have fumed. After writing a check to an organization that publicly denounced Vanderbilt business practices as exploitative. The checks themselves were a drop in the ocean of their wealth, but the symbolism was a tidal wave. It was a betrayal of class solidarity, an unconscionable act that blurred the rigid lines between us and them, between the powerful and the powerless. The threat of disinheritance, or at the very least a severe curtailing of her financial autonomy, was wielded not as a vague possibility, but as a concrete, looming weapon. William and other male family members would have confronted her with stark ultimatums. Cease these embarrassing public endorsements of radical causes, or see her access to the Vanderbilt treasury severely restricted. They argued that her behavior was destabilizing, that it made the family a laughingstock in the boardrooms where real power was brokered. For a woman who had spent years building Marble House as a monument to her own taste and authority, this was a profound attack on her hard-won autonomy. They were attempting to financially neuter her, to reduce her back to the status of a dependent wife whose every expense required approval. This financial pressure was the most intimate form of the scandal, a desperate attempt by the patriarchal structure of the family to rein in a member who refused to stay in her designated lane. Beyond the mansion walls, the gossip columns of New York's newspapers, particularly the notorious Town Topics, became a public pillory where Alva was ritually mocked and scrutinized. In an era before celebrity blogs, these society pages were the brutal arbiters of reputation, and they feasted on the scandal of a Vanderbilt woman gone rogue. She was no longer portrayed as the brilliant hostess and architectural visionary. Now, she was depicted as a misguided, hysterical woman, a dupe of radical activists, her intelligence reframed as unnatural and her compassion as a dangerous naivete. The columns dripped with condescending pity, suggesting that the poor woman had clearly taken on more than her delicate feminine constitution could handle, that she had been led astray by unsavory influences. They published whispered rumors about the state of her marriage, framing William as the long-suffering, patient husband dealing with an unruly wife. This was a deliberate strategy to undermine her credibility by attacking her through the lens of gender, reducing her profound moral awakening to a simple case of female irrationality. The ultimate weapon in high society's arsenal, however, was social ostracization, and it was deployed with cold, surgical precision. The very invitations that had once flooded her desk, the markers of her hard-won social triumph, began to dry up. The telephone, that new instrument of connection, fell silent. When she did attend events, she was met with a wall of exquisite coldness, not outright rudeness, which would have been vulgar, but a subtle, chilling distance. Conversations would politely shift when she approached. Her opinions on social issues were met with silent, dismissive smiles. Hostesses who had once begged for her presence at their balls now found their guest lists mysteriously already full. This silent treatment was designed to inflict a very specific kind of psychological pain. It was a reminder that her position was conditional, that the glittering world she had conquered could exile her just as quickly as it had embraced her. Her name, once synonymous with taste and influence, was becoming a liability. To be seen with Alva Vanderbilt was to risk being associated with her controversial causes, to have one's own social standing tarnished by her radicalism. In a world where social capital was currency, she was being deliberately bankrupted. Yet, for Alva, this scorched earth response from her family and peers likely had an effect opposite to what they intended. Instead of crushing her spirit, their outrage served as the final, undeniable proof that her chosen path was the correct one. Their hysterical reaction to her relatively modest early efforts revealed the deep fragility of their entire value system. If the simple act of helping the poor and advocating for safer housing was enough to threaten the foundations of the Vanderbilt empire in New York society, then those foundations were built on sand. Their threats and their gossip did not shame her. They radicalized her. The isolation she experienced, while painful, also created a space of moral clarity. She was no longer trying to balance two worlds. The choice had been made for her. The gilded cage door had been slammed shut, And in that definitive act of exclusion, she found the ultimate freedom to fully become the person she was meant to be, no longer bound by the approval of a world she had grown to despise. The scandal, in the end, did not break her. It forged her into a more formidable and determined revolutionary. To comprehend the radical nature of her choice, we need to first grasp the sheer, almost incomprehensible scale of the fortune she ultimately decided to redirect. Alva's wealth was not merely substantial, it was dynastic, placing her in the uppermost stratosphere of global affluence. Her financial power originated from two primary, interconnected sources: her strategic marriage into the Vanderbilt family and the inheritance she received both during and after her union with William Kissam Vanderbilt. Upon their marriage, a meticulously crafted marriage settlement was established, a common practice among the elite to protect and control the flow of capital. This settlement provided Alva with a guaranteed, lavish annual income, a sum that was entirely separate from her household and personal expenditure accounts. This was her pin money, though that genteel term belies its colossal value. It was a river of cash ensuring her financial independence from her husband for life. The true engine of this wealth, of course, was the Vanderbilt empire itself, built by the ruthless genius of Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt and aggressively expanded by his son William Henry. The family fortune was rooted in the transportation arteries of a rapidly industrializing America. It began with a fleet of steamships dominating the coastal trade, and then, in a masterstroke, pivoted to railroads. The New York Central Railroad system became their crown jewel, a metallic spine running along the most lucrative trade corridor in the nation. Every train that carried freight from the Midwest to the port of New York, every passenger car filled with people moving between cities, poured more gold into the Vanderbilt coffers. This was not passive, inherited wealth quietly collecting interest. It was an active, voracious industrial machine that printed money by fundamentally controlling the movement of goods and people. Alva's share of this fortune, therefore, was directly tethered to the sweat of railroad workers, the ambitions of industrialists, and the relentless churn of the American economy. So, what did this actually look like in numerical terms? While a precise, single figure for Alva's total net worth is difficult to pin down, we have clear markers that illuminate its staggering proportions. Her annual personal allowance from William was reported to be over $100,000 a year in the 1880s. To put that into a modern perspective, that single year's spending money would be equivalent to approximately $3 million today. And this was just her discretionary fund for gowns, travel, and charity. It did not include the astronomical costs of building and maintaining her palaces, which were covered by separate, nearly limitless accounts. The construction of Marble House alone cost $11 million in 1892 currency, a sum that translates to well over $350 million in today's money. That was the scale on which she operated. She could spend the modern equivalent of hundreds of millions on a single summer home without making a dent in the family's principal fortune. When William Kissam Vanderbilt died in 1920, his estate was valued at around $55 million. In today's terms, that is a fortune approaching $1.5 billion. Alva, as his widow and the mother of his children, inherited a massive portion of this, but her wealth was not a static lump sum she slowly depleted. It was a dynamic, income-generating engine. She owned vast portfolios of stocks and bonds, prime real estate in the heart of New York City, and continued to receive revenue from trusts and holdings. By the time she began her most serious philanthropic work, her personal fortune was comfortably in the range of many tens of millions of dollars, a figure that in modern equivalents represents several hundred million, if not edging toward $1 billion, of spending power. This was the financial fortress she commanded, a fortress built not just of money, but of the steel rails, the land, and the industrial might of a continent. And it was this very fortress that she would methodically, intentionally, and joyfully dismantle, brick by golden brick, to fund a very different version of the American dream. Alva Vanderbilt's conversion from society queen to radical philanthropist was not a sudden whim, but the logical outcome of a deeply personal and well-articulated philosophy that she forged in the fire of her own conscience. Unlike many of her peers who viewed charity as a social obligation or a tool for moral uplift, Alva saw her wealth as a profound, almost burdensome responsibility, a vast resource that she was morally compelled to deploy for the betterment of humanity. Her motivations were a complex and potent blend of Enlightenment principles, a pragmatic understanding of power, and a fierce, unwavering belief in the fundamental potential of every human being, regardless of their birth. At the core of her belief system was a concept that would have been considered radical, even dangerous, in Gilded Age parlors. The idea that great wealth was not a sign of divine favor or superior breeding, but essentially a social trust. She came to believe that fortunes like the Vanderbilts were accumulated through a collective societal effort, through the labor of thousands of workers, the infrastructure of the nation, and the stability provided by its laws. Therefore, that wealth did not belong solely to the individual. It was held in trust for society itself, and it was the duty of the holder to return it in ways that strengthened the entire community. This was a direct challenge to the gospel of wealth preached by Andrew Carnegie, which advocated for philanthropy, but still placed the billionaire as the supreme arbiter of what was good for the masses. Alva's philosophy was more distributive and democratic. She sought not just to give, but to empower. While she was not overtly religious in a doctrinal sense, her writings reveal a powerful spiritual undercurrent rooted in a belief in moral justice and the inherent worth of every soul. In one particularly revealing letter, she wrote, "One cannot look into the eyes of a hungry child and see anything less than a reflection of one's own humanity. To turn away is to deny a part of oneself." This was not the language of pious charity. It was the language of radical empathy. She rejected the Calvinist notion that poverty was a sign of moral failure, instead arguing that circumstance and a rigged economic system were the true culprits. Her driving force was a simple yet profound conviction in human equality. She believed that the children playing in the tenement gutters possessed the same innate intelligence and potential as her own children playing in the gardens of Marble House. They simply lacked the opportunity. This is where her philosophy dovetailed strikingly with the progressive and socialist ideals gaining traction at the turn of the century, though she would have likely rejected the socialist label herself. She was at heart a pragmatist. She read the works of reformers and was deeply influenced by the growing movement for social democracy. which argued that the state had a responsibility to ensure a basic standard of living for its citizens. She did not advocate for the overthrow of capitalism, but for its radical reform. She saw her private philanthropy as a necessary stopgap, a way to demonstrate what a just society could and should provide for its people. In her diaries, she expressed frustration with the pace of political change, writing, "While the politicians debate, people suffer. We who have the means must act, not as benefactors, but as fellow citizens settling a shared debt." Her personal mission was made most relatable through her own words, which often crackle with a combination of fierce intelligence and raw compassion. In a letter defending her support for women's suffrage and labor rights, she confronted her critics head-on. "They call me a traitor to my class. But what is a class if not an artificial barrier erected to keep some in and most out? My loyalty is not to a class, but to justice." This sentiment reveals the ultimate engine of her giving, a profound rejection of the very idea of inherited superiority. Having seen the arbitrary nature of fortune through her family's own rise, fall, and rise again, she understood that the social hierarchy was a man-made construct, not a natural law. Her life's work became a deliberate, systematic effort to dismantle that construct, using the very tools it had given her. For Alva, philanthropy was not about charity. It was about reparations. It was about using the power of a Vanderbilt fortune to create a world where the accident of a Vanderbilt birth would no longer guarantee a life of unearned advantage. Guided by this powerful internal compass, Alva channeled her fortune not into a vague, scattershot philanthropy, but into a highly targeted, strategic campaign aimed at the very foundations of social inequality. She identified specific pressure points in the system areas where a concentrated infusion of capital and influence could create not just temporary relief, but lasting structural change. Her giving was a surgeon's scalpel, not a watering can. One of her most profound and enduring commitments was to the cause of education, particularly for those systematically excluded from it. She understood that knowledge was the ultimate currency of empowerment, the key that could unlock a future far beyond the confines of a tenement slum. While many wealthy patrons funded established universities for the elite, Alva focused on the very beginning of the latter. She became a major benefactor of kindergartens and nursery schools in impoverished immigrant neighborhoods. At a time when early childhood education was a luxury for the rich, she recognized it as a vital necessity for the poor, a safe haven for children who would otherwise be left to roam dangerous streets while their parents worked, and a crucial foundation for literacy and social skills. Her donations didn't just pay for buildings. They paid for trained teachers, for nutritious meals, for books and blocks and crayons, creating islands of order and hope in a sea of chaos. She also heavily supported vocational training schools, understanding that for a teenage boy or girl from the Lower East Side, a practical skill like carpentry, sewing, or mechanics was a more immediate path to a living wage than a classical education. This was philanthropy with a clear-eyed, pragmatic goal: to equip the next generation with the actual tools they needed to climb out of poverty. Her passion for education, however, reached its most radical and personal expression in her fervent, lifelong support for women's suffrage and higher learning for women. This was the cause that would ultimately consume her, and for a very simple reason. She saw the parallels between her own gilded confinement and the legal subjugation of all women. Alva didn't just write checks to the National American Woman Suffrage Association. She became one of its most visible, outspoken, and strategically brilliant leaders. She used her social notoriety as a weapon, staging massive, headline-grabbing rallies and parades that forced the issue into the public eye. She famously organized and funded the 1914 Women's Suffrage Parade in New York City, a spectacular event that brought thousands of women from all walks of life into the streets, demanding the vote. But for Alva, the vote was just the beginning. She believed economic and intellectual independence were just as crucial. This is why she made one of her most transformative gifts to what would become Hunter College, a tuition-free college for women in New York City. By funding a place where the daughters of immigrants and the working class could receive a first-rate education for free, she was actively creating a new class of professional women: doctors, lawyers, teachers, scientists who could support themselves and shape their own destinies. She wasn't just asking for a place at the table for women. She was using her fortune to build an entirely new table and fill it with women who had earned their seats. Beyond the schoolhouse, Alva directed vast sums toward the fundamental human needs of health care and housing. She had seen the tuberculosis and rickets that plagued tenement children, and she knew that no amount of education could flourish in a body weakened by sickness and malnutrition. She became a major patron of the Visiting Nurse Service, an organization that sent trained nurses directly into the homes of the sick poor, providing care that they could never afford at a hospital. She also funded public sanitariums for tuberculosis patients and donated generously to hospitals that served the immigrant communities, often insisting that her contributions be used to expand outpatient clinics so that preventative care could reach the most people. Her interest in housing reform was equally hands-on. While others debated tenement laws in abstract terms, Alva invested in model housing projects. She provided seed money for construction companies that were experimenting with safe, clean, affordable apartment buildings that featured modern plumbing, adequate light, and ventilation, a stark contrast to the dark, airless fire traps that were the standard for the poor. These initiatives were all connected by a single, powerful insight: that poverty was a multi-headed monster. To fight it, you had to attack it on all fronts simultaneously, healing the body, sheltering the family, and enlightening the mind. Finally, in a move that surprised many, Alva also became a significant patron of the arts, but again with a deeply democratic twist. She didn't just collect old masters for her private galleries. She funded public art installations, community music schools, and theater programs in settlement houses. She believed that beauty and creative expression were not luxuries for the wealthy, but fundamental human needs that nourished the spirit and provided a necessary escape from the grinding grimness of industrial life. Funding a violin lesson for a child in a tenement or supporting a local theater troupe was, in her eyes, as much an act of social justice as funding a soup kitchen. It was an investment in human dignity, a declaration that every person, regardless of their station, deserved access to the things that make life worth living. Her support for the arts was the final piece of her philanthropic philosophy, a holistic vision of human uplift that addressed not just survival, but the soul. Through these carefully chosen causes: education, suffrage, health, housing, and the arts, Alva Vanderbilt was not merely giving away her money. She was meticulously constructing a new social blueprint, using the wealth of the Gilded Age to lay the foundation for a more just and beautiful world for everyone. Of course, the act of giving away a fortune of this magnitude was never going to be as simple as writing a check. It required navigating a legal labyrinth specifically designed to prevent exactly what Alva was trying to do: dismantle the dynastic wealth her family had spent generations accumulating. The most formidable obstacles were not the scowls of society hostesses, but the cold, rigid language of trust funds and inheritance law. These legal instruments were the ultimate fortifications of Gilded Age wealth, engineered to bind capital to the family name in perpetuity, passing it from one generation to the next with minimal interference from taxes, or, most importantly, from the whims of any individual heir who might get philanthropic ideas. The primary legal weapon wielded against her was the concept of the spendthrift trust. This was not a casual term, but a precise legal construct created to protect a beneficiary from their own financial imprudence, or, in Alva's case, from their own radical generosity. These trusts were typically established by a patriarch, like Commodore Vanderbilt or his son William Henry, to control the flow of money long after their deaths. The terms were ironclad. A beneficiary, such as Alva, would receive a generous, regular income from the trust's investments, but they were legally barred from accessing the principal, the massive underlying fortune itself. They couldn't sell it, borrow against it, or, crucially, give it away. The principal was like an enormous golden goose that was legally mandated to keep laying golden eggs for the designated Vanderbilt heirs forever. The entire system was a masterclass in controlling the future from beyond the grave, and it stood in direct opposition to Alva's desire to redirect that capital towards social change. The legal battles began in earnest as her philanthropic ambitions grew. When relatives realized that her charitable impulses were not a passing phase, but a core mission that threatened their future inheritances, they moved to stop her. We can imagine the tense family meetings, the outraged letters from nephews and cousins, the urgent consultations with teams of lawyers. The arguments against her were predictable but potent. They likely accused her of violating the sacred intentions of the family patriarchs, of jeopardizing the financial security of future generations, and of acting against the best interests of the Vanderbilt dynasty as a whole. One particularly bitter lawsuit, shrouded in the private records of the wealthy but hinted at in court dockets of the era, was initiated by a consortium of Vanderbilt relatives. Their claim was that Alva's massive donations constituted a form of waste or a dissipation of assets, arguing that her philanthropy was not a reasonable use of her income, but an irrational act that effectively destroyed capital meant to preserve the family's power. They sought to have her declared financially incompetent, a tactic commonly used to control wealthy women who stepped out of line, hoping a court would appoint a male relative to manage her funds and cut off her charitable spigot. Facing this legal onslaught required Alva to become not just a philanthropist, but a shrewd legal strategist. She assembled her own formidable team of attorneys, often seeking out younger, more progressive lawyers who understood the shifting social landscape and were willing to fight traditional interpretations of property law. Her defense was as radical as her philanthropy. She argued that her use of the funds was not waste, but a prudent and moral investment in the social stability upon which the Vanderbilt fortune ultimately depended. Her lawyers contended that by alleviating the suffering that led to social unrest and supporting the education that created a skilled workforce, she was ensuring the long-term security of the very economic system that generated the family's wealth. It was a brilliant argument, framing her giving not as a destruction of capital, but as its most enlightened and forward-thinking application. Beyond defending herself in court, Alva went on the offensive, proactively seeking ways to break the trusts that bound her. This was a painstaking, years-long process of legal maneuvering. Her lawyers would scrutinize the original trust documents for any possible loophole, a vague clause, an ambiguous definition, a technicality that could be exploited. In some cases, they successfully petitioned the courts to reinterpret the terms of a trust, arguing that changing social conditions rendered the original restrictions obsolete or against public policy. In other instances, when she had control over trusts established for her own children, she would work with them to mutually agree to dissolve the arrangement, redirecting the funds to their intended charitable purposes. This was a delicate and often emotionally charged process, requiring her to convince her own heirs that a legacy of social progress was more valuable than a legacy of pure, unearned wealth. Her relentless determination in these legal fights was perhaps her most profound rebellion. She was using the law, the very tool the patriarchy had created to control her, to liberate not only herself, but the fortune they sought to hoard. Every successful case, every trust modified or broken, was a crack in the foundation of dynastic wealth. The protracted nature of these battles, with their draining legal costs and emotional toll, would have broken a person with less conviction. For Alva, however, each courtroom victory was not just about accessing funds. It was a symbolic triumph. It was the law itself, that great defender of property rights, being forced to acknowledge a higher principle, that no fortune is truly private, and that every individual, even an heiress, has the right to use their resources in pursuit of a conscience. The millions she eventually gave away were not just donations. They were spoils of war, won in a quiet, paper-strewn battlefield against the entrenched power of her own name. Imagine, if you will, the scene inside one of the grandest private residences ever built in America, Marble House in Newport. The walls are solid marble, the ceilings are masterpieces of gilded art, and a single doorknob likely cost more than a working man's annual salary. Now hold that image and let it dissolve into the reality of Alva Vanderbilt's final years. Her home was a simple, unadorned apartment in a respectable but unremarkable building in Paris. The rooms were small, the furniture was functional, and the most valuable object in sight was likely a well-loved book. This was not a fall from grace. It was a deliberate, hard-won landing into a life of her own design. After systematically dismantling her fortune, Alva did not merely adopt a posture of simplicity. She embraced an existence defined by intellectual labor and modest means, a reality that would have been unimaginable to the young woman who once presided over a staff of 60. Her primary source of income in this new chapter was as astonishing as her philanthropy. She became a professional writer. While many wealthy women dabbled in writing as a genteel hobby, Alva turned to it out of necessity and passion, producing a steady stream of articles, essays, and memoirs for publication. The woman who had once commanded architects now commanded words. Her sharp intellect and formidable will channeled into crafting arguments for women's rights, social reform, and progressive politics. The income from this work was modest, a tiny fraction of her former allowance, but it was hers, earned by the sweat of her brow and the power of her mind. She was no longer a beneficiary of a trust fund. She was a working intellectual, her financial independence secured not by birthright, but by her own talent and effort. This shift from living on inherited capital to earning a living through intellectual labor was the ultimate embodiment of her philosophy. The daily rhythm of her life reflected this profound transformation. Gone were the days dictated by the social calendar, the obligatory morning calls, the fittings for new gowns, the planning of extravagant parties. Her time was now her own, structured around her work and her causes. A typical day might begin early with several hours of dedicated writing at a simple desk. The silence of her apartment broken only by the scratch of her pen. The afternoons were often reserved for meetings with fellow suffragists, labor organizers, and reformers who sought her counsel and strategic mind. These were not society teas. They were working sessions, filled with intense debate and meticulous planning. In the evenings, she might read voraciously and across a wide range of subjects, or engage in spirited correspondence with thinkers and activists across Europe and America. Her social circle was no longer the 400, but a global network of revolutionaries and visionaries. This was a life of the mind, an existence rich with purpose and camaraderie, even as it was stripped of material luxury. The contrasts with her former life were not just philosophical. They were starkly, almost humorously, physical. The woman who had once owned multiple palaces, each requiring a small army of servants to maintain, now lived in a space she could clean herself. She no longer had a personal maid to dress her hair or a footman to open doors. She prepared simple meals, managed her own modest budget, and walked to appointments instead of riding in a velvet-lined carriage. The sheer quiet of her new life must have been its most profound feature. The constant low hum of a vast household staff, the footsteps on marble, the distant clatter from the kitchens, the rustle of silk gowns being laid out, was replaced by a simple, contemplative silence. This was not a life of deprivation, but one of breathtaking clarity. Every object in her home had a purpose. Every hour of her day had intention. The frantic performance of wealth had been replaced by the authentic, unadorned work of building a better world. What is truly remarkable, and what speaks volumes about her character, is that those who knew her in this later period consistently described her not as a woman diminished by her lack of wealth, but as someone radiating a profound and newfound contentment. The immense social pressure that had once constricted her was gone. The need to conform, to perform, to constantly assert her status through consumption. All that exhausting psychic weight had been lifted. Friends remarked on her lighter demeanor, her ready laugh, and a sense of peace that had been absent during her years as a society queen. She had traded the gilded cage for the open sky, and the freedom was exhilarating. The woman who had everything had been perpetually restless. The woman who had given it all away had found a deep, and abiding satisfaction. Her modest apartment was not a cell of poverty, but a command center for a life fully lived, a testament to the radical idea that true wealth is not measured in possessions, but in the power to live in unwavering alignment with one's own conscience. The public narrative surrounding Alva Vanderbilt's transformation was a battlefield, fought not with swords, but with ink and gossip, where she was cast in wildly contradictory roles depending on the reader's own worldview. For the working class and the burgeoning progressive movement, she was nothing short of a secular saint, a living miracle of conscience. Newspapers that catered to immigrant communities and labor unions wrote about her with a reverence typically reserved for folk heroes. They portrayed her not as a distant benefactor, but as a comrade, a traitor to her class who had chosen solidarity over safety. In the pages of these publications, her donations were meticulously cataloged, each one presented as a victory for the common person. When she funded a new nursery school in a tenement district or a clinic for factory workers, it was celebrated as a direct blow against the system. Her image, once a symbol of unattainable luxury, was repurposed into a symbol of radical hope. For a seamstress working 16-hour days or a dock worker on strike, the knowledge that someone from the most fortified citadel of wealth was on their side was psychologically transformative. It validated their struggles and lent an immeasurable credibility to their cause. She became our Alva, a patron saint of the disenfranchised, yet in the drawing rooms and clubhouses of her former peers, and in the society pages that served them, a very different story was being told. Here, she was relentlessly caricatured as either a deluded fool or a dangerous hysteric. The tone was one of condescending pity laced with venom. Publications like Town Topics led the charge, suggesting that her behavior was clear evidence of a fragile feminine mind buckling under the stress of managing such vast wealth. They painted her as a gullible dupe, easily manipulated by shrewd socialist radicals who saw a vulnerable, wealthy woman and exploited her sentimental nature. Her intelligence was reframed as arrogance, her compassion as naivete. The most common and cutting critique was that she was simply an eccentric, a wealthy woman with too much time on her hands who had latched onto philanthropy as a fashionable, if bizarre, new hobby. This framing was deliberately designed to strip her actions of their profound moral and political significance. By reducing her life's work to a mere eccentricity, her critics could dismiss her without having to engage with the uncomfortable truths her philanthropy exposed about the foundations of their own wealth. Navigating this whirlwind of public opinion required a level of strategic brilliance that Alva had honed over a lifetime in the public eye. She understood the power of spectacle better than anyone, having used it to conquer New York society with her famous balls. Now she weaponized that same understanding for her causes. Instead of hiding from the press, she learned to master it. For events that advanced her mission, like the massive women's suffrage parades she organized and funded, she actively courted the media. She ensured these events were visually stunning, meticulously organized, and featured powerful, symbolic imagery that would play beautifully on the front pages of newspapers across the country. She gave carefully calculated interviews, always steering the conversation back to the issues: the need for the vote, the injustice of tenement life, the right to an education. She never apologized for her choices. Instead, She explained them with a calm, unwavering logic that disarmed her critics. When accused of betraying her class, she would calmly respond that her loyalty was to humanity, an answer that was both unassailable and deeply threatening to the social order. Her most effective shield, however, was her burgeoning community. As she became increasingly ostracized from old money society, she built a new, more vibrant family of fellow travelers, suffragists, labor leaders, educators, and reformers. This network provided her with emotional sustenance and political cover. Within this circle, she was not an eccentric. She was a valued strategist and a generous ally. Their respect and camaraderie insulated her from the barbs of the gossip columns. She no longer needed the approval of Carolina Store's set because she had found purpose and partnership among women like Anna Howard Shaw and Carrie Chapman Catt. This shift in her social world was a public declaration of independence in itself. By visibly aligning herself with activists and intellectuals, she signaled that her identity was no longer that of a Vanderbilt heiress, but of a reformer in her own right. The public scrutiny, therefore, ultimately had a paradoxical effect. While it aimed to isolate and punish her, it instead forced her to fully commit to her new path, cementing her legacy not as a society woman who dabbled in charity, but as a revolutionary who had chosen her side and never looked back. Her personal life, set against this dramatic backdrop of public transformation, became a landscape of equal parts profound connection and agonizing sacrifice. The end of her marriage to William Kissam Vanderbilt was not merely a private separation, but a seismic event in high society, formalized in a highly publicized divorce in 1895. While the official grounds were adultery, a charge that preserved her social standing under the unforgiving laws of the time, the true schism was far deeper. It was a rupture of worldviews. William represented the old order, the preservation of dynastic wealth, the primacy of business interests, and the expectation of a wife's silent compliance. Alva, by contrast, was hurtling toward a new horizon defined by social justice and female empowerment. Their union, a strategic alliance of two powerful families, could not withstand the force of her awakening conscience. The divorce was her most definitive declaration of independence, a necessary severing of the primary tie that bound her to a life she had outgrown. Yet, this liberation came at a steep price: the permanent alienation from the father of her children and the full, unforgiving wrath of a social system that saw a divorced woman as damaged goods, no matter how vast her fortune. It was in the aftermath of this rupture, however, that she found a partnership that would sustain her for the rest of her life. Just 1 year after her divorce, Alva married Oliver Hazard Perry Belmont, a man from another prominent and wealthy family. On the surface, it seemed like she was simply trading one gilded cage for another. But Oliver was different. He was, by many accounts, a more progressive and intellectually curious man than William. More importantly, he was not threatened by Alva's formidable intellect or her passionate commitments. Instead of demanding she curtail her activities, he became her most ardent supporter. Oliver did not merely tolerate her philanthropy, he actively encouraged it, providing not just financial backing, but emotional solidarity. He stood beside her at suffrage events, used his own social connections to advance her causes, and offered a private sanctuary where she could retreat from the public battles and be fully herself. Their homes, including his magnificent Newport estate, Belcourt, became de facto headquarters for the movement, filled with the energized conversations of reformers rather than the idle chatter of socialites. In Oliver, Alva found the rarest of treasures in Gilded Age America, a husband who saw her not as an ornament or a subordinate, but as an equal partner in a shared moral crusade. This supportive union, however, came with its own set of social complications and personal costs. While Oliver was her rock, their marriage further isolated them from the mainstream of their class. To be a divorced woman was scandalous. To be a divorced woman who then married a man from her same social stratum was seen as audacious. To then use that second marriage as a platform for radical activism was, in the eyes of their peers, a deliberate provocation. Many of their old friendships evaporated completely. The couple found themselves excluded from the very events that had once defined their calendars. The silence from former friends was a constant, subtle punishment, a reminder that they had chosen a path of purposeful exile. Yet, within this isolation, their bond deepened. They became a team, a fortress of two against the world. Their relationship strengthened by a shared sense of purpose and a mutual disregard for the conventions they were dismantling. Beyond her marriage, Alva's philanthropic mission fundamentally reshaped her entire web of friendships. The lively, glittering social circle of her youth, women who discussed fashion, European tours, and the intricacies of the guest list for the next ball simply could not comprehend the woman she was becoming. The gossip and subtle ostracization she faced were not just about disapproval. They were about a fundamental failure to connect. She was speaking a new language of suffrage parades and tenement reform, while they were still conversing in the dialect of dinner menus and ball gowns. These relationships, built on the shallow foundation of shared status, withered and died from a lack of common ground. It was a painful pruning of her personal life, a loss of the comfort and familiarity she had known since childhood. In their place, she cultivated a new, more vibrant community drawn from the ranks of the movements she championed. Her closest confidantes became women like Anna Howard Shaw and Carrie Chapman Catt, leaders of the National American Woman Suffrage Association. These were friendships forged in the trenches of political struggle, based on shared ideology, mutual respect, and intellectual companionship. Her salons were no longer filled with society matrons, but with labor organizers, muckraking journalists, and visionary educators. The conversations in her home were urgent, passionate, and real. These new friends did not care about her pedigree. They valued her strategic mind, her boundless energy, and her unwavering financial support. In this new community, she was not judged by who she had been born, but by what she was doing to change the world. This trade superficial society friendships for deep, purposeful alliances was arguably one of the most rewarding of her life. The question of romantic prospects beyond her marriage to Oliver is a poignant one. After his death in 1908, Alva was still a relatively young woman, only in her mid-50s, and immensely wealthy even after her giving. Yet there is no record of her seeking or entertaining another romantic partnership. This was likely a conscious choice. Having finally found a partnership built on genuine mutual respect, she may have felt that lightning could not strike twice. More significantly, her life was now so completely consumed by her mission that there was little room for anything else. Her passion had been redirected from the personal and romantic to the political and universal. She had channeled all her formidable energy, her capacity for love and devotion, into the fight for millions of women she would never meet. The movement became her family, its successes her greatest joy, its setbacks her deepest sorrows. In sacrificing the possibility of another intimate romantic relationship, she gained the immense, sprawling, and demanding family of a cause, a trade that for a soul like hers was likely no sacrifice at all. The sheer scale of Alva's giving meant that its effects were felt not as gentle ripples, but as powerful, transformative waves crashing against the shores of poverty and inequality. Her money did not vanish into abstract administrative costs. It materialized into physical structures, functioning institutions, and most importantly, into changed human lives. One of the most visible and enduring monuments to her philanthropy was her profound impact on the educational landscape of New York City. Her belief that knowledge was the ultimate weapon against poverty led her to fund the construction of an entire school for girls on the Lower East Side, a neighborhood teeming with immigrant families struggling to survive. This was not a drab, utilitarian building. Alva insisted on an architecturally sound, beautiful structure filled with light and air, a deliberate contrast to the dark tenements the students called home. Inside, the classrooms were equipped with modern desks, well-stocked libraries, and science laboratories, amenities previously reserved for the children of the wealthy. The curriculum was revolutionary for its time, blending rigorous academic instruction with practical vocational training. A young girl from an Italian immigrant family could spend her morning studying literature and mathematics, and her afternoon learning stenography or dressmaking, skills that guaranteed her a respectable, living wage job upon graduation. This school alone educated thousands of girls over the decades, effectively breaking the cycle of poverty for entire families by equipping a generation of young women with the tools for economic independence. The impact of her support for the Henry Street settlement and the visiting nurse service offers another vivid, human-scale example of her philanthropy in action. Before Alva's involvement, the visiting nurse service was a small, struggling operation. Her massive infusion of capital allowed it to expand from a handful of nurses into a citywide force. The statistical data is staggering. Within just a few years of her sustained funding, the number of home visits conducted annually skyrocketed from a few thousand to over 100,000. This meant that a mother in a cramped tenement, terrified as her infant burned with fever, no longer had to choose between a costly doctor she couldn't afford and watching her child suffer. A visiting nurse, funded by Alva's donations, would arrive at her door, providing professional medical care, instructions on hygiene and nutrition, and just as importantly, a message of hope. There are records of nurses saving children from near certain death from diphtheria and pneumonia, of mothers learning how to sterilize milk to prevent deadly diseases, and of elderly, bedridden individuals receiving compassionate care that allowed them to live out their days with dignity. Each of these 100,000 annual visits was a story, a life saved, a suffering alleviated, a family kept intact. Alva's fortune bought not just medicine, but peace of mind for an entire city of the invisible poor. Perhaps the most dramatic illustration of her immediate impact can be found in her funding of model tenements. While reformers wrote reports about the need for better housing, Alva used her wealth to build it. She provided the crucial seed money for the City and Suburban Homes Company, one of the first large-scale efforts to construct safe, sanitary, and affordable housing for working-class families. One of their first projects, built with her backing, was a complex on the Upper East Side that replaced a notorious slum. The difference was night and day. Where once there were dark, airless rooms with shared, stinking outhouses in the backyard, now there were apartments with private toilets, running water, cross ventilation for fresh air, and fire escapes. The death rate from tuberculosis and other communicable diseases in the new building plummeted almost immediately. One surviving tenant letter from the era describes the profound psychological shift this caused. "We no longer go to bed fearing a spark will trap us in a fire trap. My children can breathe, and they have not been sick all winter. It feels like we have moved into a new world." This was the tangible good in its purest form, the direct translation of capital into human safety and well-being, a literal lifting of people out of squalor and into an environment that supported life, not threatened it. Beyond these institutional achievements, Alva's most personal crusade, women's suffrage, benefited from her largesse in ways that fundamentally altered the political landscape. The suffrage movement was perpetually cash-strapped, unable to compete with the well-funded opposition from business interests and political machines. Alva's money changed the game. She didn't just write a check. She bankrolled an entire modern political campaign. Her funding paid for the printing and distribution of millions of pamphlets and posters, translating complex legal arguments into simple, powerful messages that could be understood by women from all walks of life. It financed the trains and buses that brought thousands of women from rural areas to massive rallies in state capitals, creating a visible, undeniable show of force that the press could not ignore. Most famously, her money paid for the historic 1915 Women's Suffrage Parade in New York City, a spectacle of such scale and professionalism that it dominated national headlines for weeks. She hired professional organizers, paid for elaborate floats and banners, and even covered the legal fees for women who were arrested during the march. This single event, made possible by her fortune, is widely credited with shifting public opinion and building the momentum that eventually led to New York State granting women the vote in 1917, a full 3 years before the federal amendment. In this case, the ripple effect was a political tsunami, and Alva Vanderbilt was the force that set it in motion. Her philanthropy built schools that educated minds, clinics that healed bodies, homes that sheltered families, and a political movement that empowered half the population. The immediate impact was a city made healthier, safer, and more just, one life, one family, one community at a time. But even as her work transformed countless lives, Alva Vanderbilt's radical approach to philanthropy did not escape sharp criticism, and a truly balanced portrait requires us to listen to the arguments of her detractors. One of the most persistent critiques, often whispered in the clubs and drawing rooms of her peers, but also voiced by some serious social thinkers of the era, was that her methods were fundamentally naive. These critics argued that Alva, for all her intelligence, was an idealist who viewed complex social problems through a romantic, sentimental lens. They contended that she was driven by emotion rather than cold, hard rationality, and that this led her to support causes that sounded noble but were ultimately ineffective or even counterproductive. From this perspective, her willingness to fund striking workers or advocate for radical tenement reforms was not strategic philanthropy, but a dangerous dabbling in forces she did not fully understand. Her critics saw her as a wealthy amateur, a woman whose sheltered upbringing had left her unprepared for the gritty, often cynical realities of political and economic power struggles, making her an easy target for manipulation by more savvy activists who saw her fortune as a means to their own ends. A more substantive and enduring criticism centered on the concept of dependency. This argument, often associated with the philosophy of conservative economists and social Darwinists of the period, suggested that Alva's brand of wholesale, systemic giving was actually harmful to its intended beneficiaries. The logic went that by providing such extensive support, free schools, free health care, subsidized housing, she was undermining the very virtues of thrift, hard work, and self-reliance that were essential for upward mobility. Critics worried that she was creating a permanent underclass dependent on her charity, rather than empowering individuals to lift themselves up by their own bootstraps. They might have pointed to her model tenements and asked, does providing such improved housing at below market rates discourage people from striving to earn enough to afford it on their own? Does funding an entire settlement house create a culture of expectation where the poor come to rely on the generosity of the wealthy instead of their own initiative? This view framed her philanthropy not as empowerment, but as a form of benevolent oppression that could stifle ambition and create a cycle of reliance. Financial critics took a different tack, questioning the sheer scale and perceived irresponsibility of her giving. To them, the purposeful dismantling of a dynastic fortune was not an act of moral courage, but a profound failure of stewardship. They argued that such vast wealth was not meant to be liquidated in a single generation. It was a trust to be preserved and grown, ensuring stability and influence for descendants and the institutions the family traditionally supported. By giving away the principal of her fortune, Alva was, in their eyes, destroying capital, the very engine of economic progress that created jobs and funded innovation. They might have conceded that funding a scholarship was admirable, but gutting a trust fund worth tens of millions to do so was financially reckless. This perspective saw her not as a visionary, but as a poor custodian of the resources she had been given, squandering a legacy that could have provided a steady stream of charitable income for centuries if managed conservatively, rather than being spent in a dramatic, and in their view, short-sighted burst. Even from within the progressive and suffrage movement she championed, Alva faced a more subtle form of critique related to her personality and methods. Her immense wealth and the sheer force of her will could sometimes come across as domineering. Some fellow suffragists, while grateful for her financial clout, privately expressed concerns that she attempted to exert too much control over strategy, using her money as a lever to dictate the movement's direction. There were tensions, for instance, over the planning of parades and the messaging of campaigns, where her vision, backed by her bankroll, could override the consensus of elected movement leaders. This created a complex power dynamic where her support was essential, but her influence could feel overbearing to those who did not come from a world of command and control. She was, in essence, critiqued for the very authority she had learned in the ballrooms of New York, an authority that sometimes clashed with the more collaborative, democratic ideals of the movements she sought to advance. Perhaps the most personal and cutting criticism was the accusation of hypocrisy. How could a woman who lived in marble palaces and owned multiple estates truly understand the plight of the poor? How could she claim solidarity with the working class while her fortune originated from the very railroads and industries accused of exploiting labor? Detractors painted her as a performer in a drama of her own creation, using the cause of social justice as a stage upon which to act out a new, more exciting role. They argued that her philanthropy was ultimately a form of supreme vanity, a project of self-actualization that used the suffering of others as its raw material. From this cynical viewpoint, the settlement house visits and the funding of radical causes were not driven by genuine empathy, but by a deep-seated boredom with the trivialities of high society and a thirst for a different kind of power and recognition. This critique struck at the heart of her motives, suggesting that her entire life's work was an elaborate, self-serving performance rather than an authentic expression of moral duty. Yet, when we hold these criticisms up against the reality of her actions and their outcomes, a more nuanced picture emerges. While the charge of naivete had a superficial plausibility, it fails to account for the strategic, long-term thinking behind her giving. She did not just throw money at problems. She invested in institutions like the Henry Street Settlement and Hunter College, which were designed to create systemic, lasting change. The accusation of fostering dependency is similarly challenged by the results. The education she funded led to economic independence for thousands of women, and the improved housing she supported created stable environments where families could thrive, not stagnate. As for the financial irresponsibility, one could argue that she was simply accelerating the process of social investment, believing the urgent needs of the present could not wait for the slow drip of a perpetual trust fund. She chose to be a catalyst, not a custodian. The tensions within the suffrage movement highlight the inevitable complications that arise when vast wealth meets grassroots organizing, but they do not negate the undeniable fact that her resources were a decisive factor in achieving victory. And the charge of hypocrisy, while emotionally potent, is ultimately a distraction from the material good her work accomplished. Whether motivated by vanity or virtue, the schools were built, the nurses were paid, and the votes were won. Her legacy, therefore, exists not in a space of pure sainthood or cynical performance, but in the messy, complicated, and profoundly impactful reality of a woman who used every tool at her disposal, facing down a chorus of criticism to reshape the world according to her conscience. In her final years, Alva Vanderbilt Belmont settled into a life that was a quiet but powerful testament to her transformed values. The woman who had once been the reigning queen of Gilded Age society now found her greatest satisfaction not in opulent balls, but in the steady, tangible progress of the causes she had funded with her fortune. Her days in her modest Paris apartment were filled with correspondence from suffragists across the United States and Europe, and she took immense, quiet pride in watching the movement she had helped bankroll achieve its ultimate goal, the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920, granting American women the right to vote. For Alva, this was not a distant political victory. It was the culmination of a personal crusade the final, undeniable proof that her life's redirection had been worth every scandal and every sacrificed social connection. Friends who visited her noted that she spoke of the suffrage win with more passion and pride than she had ever displayed when discussing the construction of Marble House. It was the ultimate validation of her belief that building a more just world was a far greater legacy than building a summer palace. When asked in rare interviews if she had any regrets about her extraordinary life path, her response was characteristically direct and unflinching. She expressed no longing for the jewels she had sold or the mansions she had left behind. If she voiced any regret at all, it was not for the wealth she had given away, but for the time she felt she had wasted in her youth, conforming to the empty rituals of high society before she found her true purpose. She once remarked to a journalist that her only real sorrow was that she had not begun her philanthropic work sooner, wishing she could have awakened to the injustices around her with the same clarity in her 20s that she possessed in her 40s. This was not a lament about the loss of luxury, but a profound reflection on the preciousness of time and the urgency of moral action. She had no patience for those who suggested she had been reckless. In her view, it would have been the true recklessness to have lived and died a Vanderbilt socialite without ever having challenged the system that gave her such unearned privilege. Society's view of her in old age remained deeply fractured, a clear reflection of the unresolved tensions she had exposed in the American class system. To the established families of New York and Newport, she was still largely a pariah, a bizarre and embarrassing figure who had committed the unforgivable sin of turning her back on her own kind. In their circles, her name was mentioned with a shake of the head, a final, dismissive judgment on a life they considered wasted. Yet, simultaneously, a new generation of progressives, reformers, and educated women saw her as a pioneering hero. Universities and women's organizations began to seek her out, not for her money, as she had little left to give, but for her wisdom and her story. She was invited to speak, not as a benefactor, but as an elder stateswoman of social change. This slow, late-life shift in perception meant that she was, in a sense, witnessing the birth of her own legend, seeing the first glimmers of how history would ultimately judge her, not as a scandalous society woman, but as a pivotal figure in the fight for gender equality and social justice. She never sought or received any formal official recognition from the government or traditional institutions of her former world. There were no medals from the state, no honorary titles bestowed by the society that had exiled her. Her recognition was of a different, more powerful kind. It came in the form of letters from thousands of women who had been able to attend college because of her scholarships, from families who had been kept healthy by the visiting nurses she funded, and from the young women who now walked into voting booths for the first time, their political power secured in part by her relentless financial and strategic support. This grassroots gratitude was the only accolade she ever wanted. It affirmed that her choice to redirect her fortune had not been a mere transfer of wealth, but a successful investment in human potential. The love and respect she received from the movement she championed provided a warmth and fulfillment that all the adulation of the Gilded Age ballrooms had never been able to offer. Alva Vanderbilt Belmont passed away in 1933, not in a cavernous mansion, but in her simple Paris home, surrounded by the books and papers that had defined her later years. Her death was noted on both sides of the Atlantic, and the obituaries captured the enduring contradiction of her life. The more conservative press still defined her by her origins, leading with headlines like "Vanderbilt Heiress and Social Leader Dies." But the emerging narrative, the one that has only grown stronger with time, focused on her transformation. It highlighted her not as a creature of wealth, but as a force who had used that wealth as a tool for monumental change. Her physical legacy, the schools, the settlement houses, the women's colleges continued their work long after she was gone. A living, breathing monument far more enduring than any statue or mausoleum. Her true legacy, however, is the enduring idea that privilege carries with it a profound responsibility, and that the most radical act an heiress can commit is not to wear the finest diamonds, but to dismantle the very system that placed them upon her neck, using its resources to build a world where such arbitrary privilege might one day become obsolete. To truly grasp the revolutionary nature of Alva's philanthropy, we need to zoom out from her personal story and view it against the sprawling backdrop of her time, an era of dizzying contradiction known as the Gilded Age, which was then giving way to the reform-minded progressive era. This was a period when America's industrial machine was roaring at full throttle, generating fortunes of a scale never before seen in human history, while simultaneously creating a vast, struggling underclass living in squalor. The nation was a canvas of stark contrasts: towering skyscrapers shadowed fetid slums, and the gleam of new railroads cut through landscapes of poverty. It was within this crucible of extreme wealth and extreme need that the very concept of modern philanthropy was born, and the choices made by the wealthy would define the social fabric for generations. Alva's actions become even more remarkable when we place her directly alongside the other philanthropic giants of her day, whose philosophies, while ambitious, operated from a fundamentally different set of principles. Consider the approach of Andrew Carnegie, the steel magnate whose name is synonymous with Gilded Age charity. Carnegie articulated his beliefs in his famous essay, The Gospel of Wealth, which became the playbook for many of his peers. He argued that the wealthy had a moral obligation to distribute their surplus riches for the public good, but his method was one of top-down, paternalistic control. Carnegie believed that the man who accumulated the fortune was uniquely qualified to decide how it should be spent for the benefit of the masses. His monumental gifts, thousands of public libraries, concert halls, and universities, were, without question, transformative. They provided crucial institutions that fostered culture and learning. However, this model, often called wholesale philanthropy, rarely challenged the underlying power structures. It did not seek to empower the poor to speak for themselves, but rather to provide them with what the wealthy donor had determined was good for them. A Carnegie library was a gift of immense value, but it did not address the systemic issues of low wages or political disenfranchisement that kept its patrons in poverty. It was charity designed to uplift, but not to fundamentally redistribute power. In stark contrast, Alva Vanderbilt's giving was intensely personal, targeted, and deeply radical in its intent. While Carnegie built temples of knowledge, Alva funded the tools of liberation. Her focus was not on creating grand institutions for public use, but on enabling individual agency, particularly for women and the working poor. Where Carnegie's philanthropy could feel distant and architectural, Alva's was intimate and human. She didn't just build a settlement house, she worked in it, listening to the mothers and children it served. She didn't just endow a university, she specifically funded a tuition-free college for women, understanding that economic and intellectual independence were the most direct paths to breaking the chains of dependency. Her support for the labor movement and tenement reform was a direct assault on the very economic systems that had created the Vanderbilt's wealth, a level of systemic critique that Carnegie and his peers carefully avoided. Her philanthropy was not a gospel delivered from on high. It was a partnership, an act of solidarity that acknowledged the recipients of her aid as equals in a shared struggle for a more just world. The chasm between Alva and her own social peers was even wider and more revealing. For every Alva Vanderbilt, there were 100 other heirs and heiresses who clung to their fortunes with a tenacity born of fear and tradition. Their philanthropy, to the extent it existed, was largely performative, a necessary cost of doing business in high society. It consisted of the obligatory charity ball, where the wealthy paid exorbitant ticket prices to see and be seen among themselves, with only a tiny fraction of the proceeds trickling down to the actual cause. Or it took the form of naming a hospital wing or a museum gallery, acts that burnished the family name without requiring any meaningful engagement with the suffering the institution aimed to alleviate. This was philanthropy as social theater, designed to legitimize vast wealth rather than question its origins or effects. These individuals saw their fortunes as a permanent family possession, a fortress to be guarded and passed down through the generations. The idea of intentionally dismantling that fortress, of liquidating the principle of the estate as Alva did, would have been viewed not as virtue, but as a form of insanity, a betrayal of their dynasty's future. What made Alva's approach so unique and radical, therefore, was its core motivation. She was not driven by a paternalistic desire to manage the poor, nor by a socialite's need for validation. She was propelled by a powerful, empathetic, and politically charged vision of justice. Her philanthropy was a form of restitution. She came to see the Vanderbilt fortune not as a rightful inheritance, but as wealth that had been extracted from the labor of countless unnamed workers and the resources of the nation itself. In her view, returning that wealth to the people through education, healthcare, and political empowerment was not an act of charity, but a moral and democratic imperative. This perspective aligned her more closely with the spirit of the progressive era than with the Gilded Age. The progressives were activists and reformers who believed in using government and private action to curb the excesses of industrial capitalism, to clean up corrupt politics, and to create a more equitable society. Alva, with her funding of suffrage campaigns and labor advocacy, was operating squarely within this movement. She was not just a benefactor, she was a political actor, using her financial power to accelerate the pace of social change. Ultimately, her story forces us to reconsider the very purpose of great wealth. In an age where billionaires once again debate the ethics of their influence, Alva Vanderbilt Belmont stands as a profound and challenging figure. She rejected the Carnegie model of the wealthy as sole arbiters of the public good, and she defied the default setting of her class, which was to hoard and display. Instead, she embraced a third, more dangerous path. She used her fortune as a weapon to dismantle the system of privilege that had created her. Her legacy is a testament to the idea that the most transformative philanthropy is not always about building monuments, but about building movements. Not about giving people what the wealthy think they need, but about providing them with the resources to claim their own power and define their own destinies. In the grand narrative of American wealth, she remains a brilliant, complicating figure. A woman who looked at the gilded world she was born into and decided that its greatest failure was not its poverty, but its silence. A silence she spent her fortune and her life determined to break. The popular image of Alva Vanderbilt Belmont often paints her as a kind of secular saint, a woman so pure of heart that she simply woke up one day, saw the suffering of the poor, and was moved to liquidate her entire fortune in a single, breathtaking act of divine compassion. This romanticized legend is powerful, but it obscures the far more complex, strategic, and frankly more interesting reality of who she was. To understand the true woman, we must peel back the layers of myth and listen to her own words, written in her letters and diaries, which reveal not a simplistic do-gooder, but a sharp, pragmatic, and sometimes conflicted revolutionary. The first major misconception is that her philanthropy was driven solely by a soft, feminine empathy. While compassion was certainly a component, her primary motivation, as articulated in her own writings, was a fierce and unwavering sense of justice. She did not see herself as a benefactor graciously bestowing favors upon the less fortunate. She saw herself as a settler of a moral debt. In one particularly revealing letter to a fellow suffragist, she wrote, "This wealth was not created by my family in a vacuum. It was built on the backs of thousands of workers and within a society that provided the stability for it to flourish. To hoard it is not prudence, it is theft from the commonwealth." This is not the language of sentimental charity. It is the language of radical economic redistribution. She viewed her giving not as generosity, but as reparations, a necessary return of resources to their true source, the labor of the people. Another persistent myth is that she gave everything away in a single, dramatic gesture, leaving herself in poverty. The reality of her financial situation was far more nuanced and strategically managed. Alva was a brilliant tactician who understood the power of capital, and she did not simply set her fortune on fire. She systematically redirected it. Yes, she gave away the equivalent of hundreds of millions in today's dollars, but she did so over decades, often funding specific, sustainable institutions rather than making one-time handouts. She established the foundations for organizations like the Women's Political Union, ensuring they had the operational funds to continue their work long after her initial donation. Furthermore, she did not leave herself destitute. Through careful planning and by retaining some income-generating assets, she secured for herself a comfortable, albeit vastly more modest, life in her later years, one that allowed her to continue her intellectual and political work without financial anxiety. The legend of the penniless heiress is a compelling morality tale, but it's inaccurate. Her genius was not in total self-impoverishment, but in the masterful, deliberate reallocation of dynastic wealth into engines of social change, proving that one could dismantle an inheritance without succumbing to hardship. She transformed the purpose of the fortune, not just its amount. we must also confront the cynical counter-myth that she was merely a bored socialite seeking a new, more exciting hobby. This interpretation, favored by her contemporary critics, suggests her philanthropy was just another performance, a way to gain a different kind of attention and power after conquering the world of society. Yet, the historical record of her actions completely refutes this. If she were merely seeking glamour and admiration, she would have chosen far safer, more fashionable causes. Instead, she championed women's suffrage and labor rights at a time when these movements were deeply unpopular, even dangerous, and guaranteed her social ostracization. She willingly traded the adulation of the New York Times Society pages for the scorn of its editorial board. Her personal diaries from this period are filled not with self-congratulation, but with frustration, strategic calculations, and weary resolve. She writes of exhausting legal battles with her own family over trust funds, of the emotional toll of being cut by former friends, and of the slow, grinding work of political organizing. This was not the glamorous pastime of a bored millionaire. It was the all-consuming, difficult, and often thankless labor of a full-time revolutionary. The consistency of this work over more than 3 decades is the strongest evidence against the bored heiress theory. Boredom is a fleeting emotion, but a lifetime of committed action reveals a profound and deeply held belief system. Perhaps the most crucial clarification involves her relationship with the very class she came from. The romantic legend often portrays her as hating the wealthy and everything they stood for. The truth is more layered. Alva did not despise individuals. She despised a system of unearned privilege, gendered suppression, and economic exploitation that she knew was morally indefensible. She maintained relationships with some individuals from her old life who respected her choices, and she never lost her appreciation for beautiful architecture or art. What she rejected was the underlying ideology of the Gilded Age, the belief that immense wealth conferred inherent superiority and the right to rule. Her rebellion was not against people, but against a principle. This distinction is vital because it reveals the sophistication of her critique. She was not an anarchist seeking to tear down all structures. She was a progressive seeking to build more equitable ones. She used the tools of her privilege, her education, her social savvy, her access to legal and political networks to fight for a world where such privilege would be less extreme and more widely shared. Her life's work was an attempt to reform the system from within, using its own resources to dismantle its most unjust features. This nuanced position, neither total rejection nor blind acceptance, is what makes her story so enduringly relevant and so much more powerful than the simplistic legend of the angelic heiress who simply walked away from it all. Her story, however, did not end with her passing. It entered a new phase, its ripples spreading outward to influence the very DNA of modern philanthropy. While the marble palaces of Newport stand as frozen monuments to a bygone era, Alva Vanderbilt Belmont's true legacy is a living, breathing one, etched into the principles that guide how wealth is used for social good today. She demonstrated that philanthropy could be more than a salve for the conscience of the wealthy. It could be a strategic, even disruptive, force for systemic change. This idea, radical in her time, planted seeds that would slowly germinate, influencing later generations of donors to look beyond the simple charity model, which often treats symptoms, and toward philanthropic models that aim to cure the disease itself. Consider the modern framework of venture philanthropy, an approach that treats charitable giving more like venture capital investment. Proponents of this model seek out innovative nonprofits and social enterprises with the potential for high social impact, providing them not just with grants, but with strategic management advice, performance metrics, and long-term support to help them scale their solutions. The through line from Alva's work is strikingly clear. She didn't just write a check to a generic poverty fund. She acted like a venture philanthropist of her age, identifying specific, high-potential startups in the social sector. Her massive, sustained investment in the visiting nurse service was a bet on a scalable, efficient model for delivering health care to the poor. Her funding of the National American Woman Suffrage Association was a strategic investment in a political enterprise with the potential for a massive societal return, the enfranchisement of half the population. She demanded results, leveraged her influence, and provided the capital necessary for these organizations to grow from small, passionate groups into powerful national forces. She understood that to tackle entrenched injustice, charity needed the same relentless, strategic focus as business. We can also see echoes of her philosophy in the more recent principles of effective altruism, a movement that uses evidence and careful reasoning to determine the most effective ways to help others. While effective altruism often focuses on quantifiable metrics in cause areas like global health, its core mandate, to do the most good possible with every dollar spent, resonates deeply with Alva's targeted approach. She was, in her own context, practicing a form of effective altruism. She looked at the landscape of human suffering in Gilded Age New York and made calculated decisions about where her resources could achieve the greatest multiplicative effect. Funding a tuition-free college for women wasn't just about educating one individual. It was about creating a wave of female professionals, voters, and leaders who would, in turn, uplift their communities and reshape society. She was implicitly asking the question that effective altruists ask today, not just, does this cause feel good, but will this investment create the largest and most lasting ripple of positive change? Her influence can also be traced in the bold, sometimes controversial, philanthropy of contemporary figures, though they may not even know her name. When Melinda French Gates dedicates her vast resources to dismantling barriers for women and girls globally, she is working in a lineage that Alva helped to pioneer, using wealth to address the root causes of gender inequality, not just its symptoms. When Mackenzie Scott makes multi-billion-dollar, no-strings-attached gifts to hundreds of organizations, trusting them to know how best to use the funds, she is embodying a similar trust in the expertise of those on the front lines, a trust Alva showed when she worked directly with settlement house leaders and suffragists rather than imposing her own blueprint from on high. These modern philanthropists, in their own ways, are rejecting the paternalistic, top-down model of Carnegie in favor of a more collaborative, empowering, and systemic approach, a path that Alva Vanderbilt Belmont walked alone and against tremendous resistance more than a century ago. Perhaps her most profound inspiration, however, lies in her demonstration of moral courage. For every wealthy individual today who grapples with the ethical implications of their inheritance, who questions the source of their family's fortune, or who feels a deep unease with the vast inequality they see. Alva's story serves as a powerful historical precedent. She proved that it is possible to look clearly at the system that enriched you and choose to become its critic and reformer rather than its passive beneficiary. She showed that the greatest use of privilege can be to work toward a world where that very privilege holds less power. Her life answers a silent, modern question: what does meaningful atonement look like for dynastic wealth? Her answer was not guilt or self-flagellation, but action, concerted, strategic, and breathtakingly ambitious action. She translated the abstract unease of privilege into the concrete language of built schools, funded nurses, and won votes, offering a timeless blueprint for turning a legacy of accumulation into a legacy of liberation. To truly grasp the motivation behind such a monumental shift in life, we need to look beyond the ledgers and the social scandals and into the intricate workings of the human mind. Alva's story presents a fascinating case study in profound altruism, a psychological puzzle that asks why an individual would sacrifice immense personal advantage for the benefit of strangers. Modern psychology offers several frameworks that can help illuminate the inner landscape of a person like Alva, moving us past simplistic labels of saint or eccentric and toward a richer understanding of her motives. One of the most compelling lenses through which to view her actions is the concept of empathic altruism, a hypothesis developed by psychologist C. Daniel Batson. This theory posits that genuine altruism is sparked by a specific emotional response, empathic concern. This isn't just feeling for someone in a vague, pitying way. It's feeling with them, adopting their perspective and experiencing a genuine, other-oriented emotional response to their plight. For Alva, this wasn't an abstract theory. Her experiences in the tenements and settlement houses were a masterclass in perspective-taking. She didn't just observe a malnourished child. She imagined her own children in that state. She didn't just hear about a factory worker's injury. She viscerally felt the family's ensuing desperation. This powerful, sustained empathic connection likely became an unbearable psychological pressure, creating a deep-seated, intrinsic motivation to relieve that suffering, not to make herself feel good, but because their suffering genuinely caused her distress. Her philanthropy, then, can be seen as the logical, necessary outlet for this overwhelming empathic drive. Yet, empathy alone doesn't fully explain the systematic, lifelong nature of her commitment, nor does it account for the sheer scale of her rebellion. This is where another powerful psychological driver comes into play: the pursuit of meaning and purpose. Humanistic psychologists like Abraham Maslow argue that once our basic survival and esteem needs are met, we are driven by a self-actualization impulse, a need to fulfill our potential and find a purpose that transcends our own existence. For Alva, the gilded world provided for her every material and social need in spectacular excess. Yet it offered almost nothing for this highest level of psychological development. The relentless cycle of parties and palace building was, in a psychological sense, profoundly meaningless. It offered no challenge to her formidable intellect, no outlet for her deep-seated convictions, and no connection to anything larger than the Vanderbilt name. Her philanthropic awakening can be interpreted as a classic journey from a state of existential emptiness to one of profound self-actualization. In fighting for women's suffrage, she found a cause worthy of her strategic mind. In funding education for the poor, she found a purpose that engaged her deepest values. The act of giving away her fortune was not an act of self-denial, but an act of self-creation. She was building an identity that was far more robust and satisfying than heiress or society queen. She was becoming an architect of social change, and in doing so, she was meeting a fundamental human need for purpose that her life of luxury had left utterly starved. We must also consider her behavior through a sociological lens, particularly the concept of role strain. This occurs when the expectations associated with a single social role become contradictory and impossible to fulfill. Alva's role as a Gilded Age wife and mother came with a rigid set of demands: be decorative, be compliant, uphold the family status, and pass the fortune intact to the next generation. Yet her intelligence, her education, and her empathic sensitivity created powerful inner demands that were in direct conflict with this external role. The strain of trying to be the perfect Vanderbilt matron while secretly harboring radical sympathies for the labor movement and tenement reforms must have created immense internal psychological tension. Her decision to break from that role, culminating in her divorce and philanthropic crusade, can be seen as a necessary release of this unbearable pressure. She resolved the role strain not by conforming, but by rejecting the constricting role altogether and forging a new one that aligned with her authentic self. Furthermore, her story challenges the very foundation of social exchange theory, which suggests that all human interaction is a kind of transaction aimed at maximizing personal benefit. Alva's actions were the antithesis of this. She engaged in what sociologists call generalized exchange, giving immense resources to a vast, faceless society with no expectation of a direct, reciprocal return. Her reward was not social capital or a tangible good. It was the psychological satisfaction of living in accordance with her own moral code and the abstract hope of a more just world, a form of value that traditional economic and social models struggle to quantify. Delving even deeper, we encounter the intriguing concept of the wounded healer. This archetype, present in many cultures and psychological traditions, describes an individual who, having endured profound suffering or witnessed deep injustice, develops a special capacity and a driving need to heal others. Alva's early life was marked by a seismic wound, the Civil War's destruction of her family's fortune and their subsequent social displacement. This early experience of loss and instability, of falling from grace, fundamentally shaped her worldview. It stripped away the illusion of permanence that insulated most of her peers. She knew, in a way they did not, that wealth and status were fragile constructs that could vanish in an instant. This early trauma likely sensitized her to the suffering of others who had lost everything, creating a powerful point of identification. Her later work, then, can be interpreted as a lifelong effort to heal the collective wound of poverty and injustice, a wound that mirrored her own early psychic injury. She was not a detached savior from on high. She was a fellow traveler who had also known loss, and this shared experience of vulnerability may have been the deepest wellspring of her compassion. Her altruism was not born in a vacuum of perfect privilege, but was forged in the fires of her own early hardship. transforming personal pain into a universal mission. To witness the enduring power of her choices, we don't need to look up old society portraits or visit abandoned mansions. We only need to walk into the vibrant, humming heart of a modern city and see the living, breathing institutions she helped bring to life. Her legacy is not locked away in a museum display case. It is actively at work, healing, teaching, and empowering in communities every single day. Imagine stepping through the doors of the New York Infirmary, an institution whose history is deeply intertwined with her vision. Originally founded by the pioneering doctor, Elizabeth Blackwell, the first woman in America to earn a medical degree, the infirmary was a radical experiment, a hospital staffed by women for women and children, providing care in an era when female doctors were ridiculed and female patients were often misunderstood. Alva recognized the profound importance of this mission. Her financial support helped the hospital expand its services and solidify its reputation, ensuring that generations of women could receive compassionate, competent medical care from professionals who understood their specific needs. Today, that legacy continues, having evolved and merged into the fabric of the larger Beth Israel Medical Center, carrying forward that foundational commitment to serving the community with a specialized, empathetic touch. The patients walking through those doors today may never know the name Alva Vanderbilt Belmont, but they are the beneficiaries of her conviction that health care is a right, not a privilege reserved for the wealthy. Now let your virtual tour take you from the quiet hallways of healing to the bustling, energetic corridors of a public school. Travel to the Lower East Side, a neighborhood that was, in Alva's time, a dense warren of tenements filled with newly arrived immigrant families. Here, she funded the construction of an entire educational complex, a bold investment in the idea that every child, regardless of their origin or native language, deserved a foundation for a better life. She didn't just pay for the bricks and mortar. She insisted on an architectural design that promoted health and learning, with large windows to flood the classrooms with natural light and open spaces for recreation, a stark and deliberate contrast to the dark, airless homes the children returned to each day. If you were to visit a public school in that same neighborhood today, perhaps P.S. 130 or a similar institution, you would see the direct descendant of her philosophy in action. You would see classrooms where children from dozens of different countries learn side by side, their diverse voices filling the air. You would see science labs and computer rooms, modern equivalents of the vocational training she championed, equipping a new generation with the skills for the modern economy. The specific buildings she funded may have been replaced or renamed, but the educational mission she invested in, the belief that public education is the great equalizer, remains the bedrock of that community. A direct and powerful line from her strategic philanthropy to the future of thousands of young minds. Perhaps the most poignant stop on this tour is a visit to a settlement house, like the Henry Street Settlement, which Alva supported from its earliest, most fragile days. Picture the building not as a historical relic, but as a vibrant community hub. On any given afternoon, the sound of children laughing in an after-school program mixes with the determined focus of adults in an English as a second language class. In another room, a counselor might be helping a family secure heating assistance, while a local artist leads a pottery workshop for seniors. This is the living, breathing fulfillment of Alva's most radical idea: that philanthropy should not be a distant handout, but a partnership that lives within the community it serves. The Henry Street settlement today is a sprawling social service agency, but its heart remains the same as when Alva walked its halls, listening and learning. It provides mental health services, youth development programs, and support for the elderly, addressing the evolving needs of the neighborhood with the same holistic, person-centered approach she endorsed over a century ago. When she funded this work, she was betting on the potential of human connection to break the cycle of poverty. The thriving, multifaceted institution it has become is the ultimate validation of that bet, a testament to the enduring power of an idea that seemed so radical in the Gilded Age that the wealthy have a responsibility to invest not just in buildings, but in the social fabric itself. Finally, no tour of her living legacy would be complete without stepping onto a university campus, particularly one like Hunter College. Alva's support for what was then the Normal College of the city of New York was a strategic masterstroke. She understood that for women to achieve true independence, they needed access to the highest levels of education, and they needed it to be tuition-free, removing the financial barrier that kept so many brilliant minds on the sidelines. Her donations helped build the academic and physical foundation of an institution that would become a beacon of upward mobility. Today, Hunter College stands as one of the premier public colleges in the nation, a towering presence on Manhattan's Upper East Side. Its graduates include Nobel laureates, Pulitzer Prize winners, senators, and countless leaders in medicine, education, and the arts. Walk through its campus today, and you are surrounded by the manifestation of Alva's dream. Thousands of students, a vast majority of them women, from every imaginable background, receiving a world-class education. Each diploma awarded is a direct echo of her belief that intellectual talent is universal, but opportunity is not, and that the role of great wealth is to bridge that chasm. These institutions, the hospital, the public school, the settlement house, the university, are not merely buildings that bear the invisible imprint of her generosity. They are dynamic, powerful engines of equity, each one a chapter in an ongoing story of social transformation, proving that the most valuable legacy is not what you keep for yourself, but what you choose to build for everyone else. So we arrive at the ultimate, deeply personal question hanging over this entire astonishing story, a question that forces us to confront our own values about money, happiness, and the meaning of a life well lived. Was it all worth it? Was the deliberate dismantling of a dynastic fortune, the social exile, the familial strife, and the quiet end in a simple apartment a fair price to pay for the good she achieved? To even begin to answer that, we must hold two vastly different scales of measurement in our hands at once. On one side, we place the crushing weight of her personal sacrifices. Alva Vanderbilt Belmont did not just give away money. She surrendered an entire world. She exchanged the adulation of high society for its scorn, turning her famous name into a liability among the very people she had been raised to impress. The security of limitless wealth was traded for a life of financial calculation. The comfort of predictable friendships was lost, replaced by the demanding, albeit passionate, camaraderie of political struggle. And perhaps most painfully, she endured the profound rupture of her first marriage and the constant, wearying legal battles with her own family, who saw her not as a visionary, but as a traitor dismantling their legacy. These were not minor inconveniences. They were earthquakes that reshaped the very bedrock of her identity and her daily existence. Now, on the other scale, we must place the monumental and enduring good that flowed from her choices. This is not an abstract concept. It is quantifiable in human terms. Her fortune built schools that educated thousands of girls, breaking cycles of poverty for entire families. It funded nurses who made over 100,000 life-saving home visits each year, offering comfort and care in the city's most desperate slums. It financed the model tenements that lifted people out of disease-ridden fire traps and into safe, sanitary homes. And most famously, her strategic wealth helped bankroll the final successful push for the 19th Amendment, securing the right to vote for millions of American women and forever altering the nation's political landscape. Each of these achievements is a towering legacy in its own right. Together, they represent a tidal wave of social progress that reshaped American society in ways that are still felt today. The children who learned to read in her schools grew up to become teachers, nurses, and citizens. The women who gained the vote used it to advocate for their families and their futures. The ripples of her actions spread outward in an ever-widening circle, touching lives and lifting fortunes for generations she would never meet. How, then, do we balance these scales? From one perspective, the personal cost seems almost too high to bear. The loneliness, the conflict, the sheer effort of her later life stands in stark contrast to the effortless luxury she was born into. Who among us would willingly choose a path guaranteed to alienate our family, destroy our social standing, and consume our every waking moment with legal and political battles? It is a testament to the sheer difficulty of her choice that so few have ever followed in her footsteps. The gravitational pull of wealth and privilege is immense, and to break free from it requires a force of will that is as rare as it is formidable. The personal toll was undeniably real, a heavy burden carried for decades. Yet, from another angle, this very calculus reveals the limitations of measuring a life solely in terms of personal comfort and social acceptance. To judge her sacrifice as not worth it is to prioritize a life of passive comfort over one of active purpose. It values the tranquility of the gilded cage over the arduous, windswept freedom of the outside world. For Alva, the life she left behind was not just empty. It was morally untenable. The cognitive dissonance between her opulent existence and the suffering she witnessed became a psychological prison far more confining than any modest apartment. In this light, her sacrifices begin to look less like losses and more like the necessary costs of purchasing her own soul. The scorn of society was the price of her intellectual freedom. The family conflict was the cost of following her conscience. The financial constraints of her later years were the evidence that she had finally aligned her resources with her values. What she gained was something no Vanderbilt fortune could ever buy: the unshakable conviction that her life had meant something, that she had spent her brief time on earth not merely consuming, but contributing to the long, hard work of human progress. Ultimately, the question of was it worth it may be one that each of us can only answer for ourselves, based on our own deepest beliefs about wealth and responsibility. But Alva's own words and the unwavering consistency of her actions until her dying day provide the clearest possible clue to her own answer. She expressed no regret for the mansions or the jewels, only for the years she felt she had wasted before she found her true calling. The serene contentment noted by her friends in her final years suggests a woman at peace, not one haunted by what she had given up. Her story challenges us to redefine our very understanding of wealth. She forces us to ask, is a fortune truly wealth if it confines the spirit and silences the conscience? Or is true riches found in the courage to use whatever resources we have, whether vast or modest, to build a world that is more beautiful, more just, and more compassionate than the one we inherited? Alva Vanderbilt Belmont's life stands as a permanent, powerful argument for the latter. She traded the illusion of permanent security for the messy, magnificent reality of a life lived on purpose. And in doing so, she left a legacy that no market crash could ever erase and no inheritance tax could ever diminish. And so we reach the end of this extraordinary journey, a path that began in a world of almost unimaginable opulence and concluded in the quiet satisfaction of a life lived for others. Alva Vanderbilt Belmont's story is so much more than a historical curiosity. It is a profound and lasting meditation on the very nature of wealth, purpose, and what it means to live a truly significant life. She was handed a script written in gold, a guaranteed narrative of comfort and influence, and she made the conscious, radical decision to rewrite every single line. Her journey was not a straight path, but a magnificent arc, from a young woman mastering the intricate rules of high society, to a wife building marble monuments to her family's power, and finally, to a visionary who saw those monuments not as achievements, but as prisons. Her awakening was a slow burn, fueled by jarring glimpses of a different reality beyond her carriage window, by the stark evidence of muckraking journalists, and by her own growing understanding that the immense fortune she commanded was inextricably linked to the toil of countless unseen others. She did not simply donate from a distance. She immersed herself, volunteering in settlement houses and listening to the struggles of immigrant mothers, transforming abstract empathy into a steel-hard resolve for systemic change. The timeless themes at the heart of her story resonate just as powerfully today as they did in the Gilded Age. Her life forces us to confront the unsettling question of what we truly owe to the world that enables our success, however we define it. Are vast fortunes purely private property to be guarded and passed down, or are they, as Alva came to believe, a form of social trust, a resource that carries with it a weighty responsibility to the common good? She challenged the very premise that happiness is a product of accumulation, demonstrating through her own experience that profound contentment is often found not in acquiring more, but in contributing to something larger than oneself. She traded the exhausting performance of wealth for the authentic joy of meaningful work, finding that a life aligned with one's deepest values, even a life of relative modesty, offers a richness that no bank vault can ever contain. Her legacy is a permanent rebuttal to the idea that money is an end in itself, proposing instead that its greatest value lies in its potential to be converted into justice, opportunity, and human dignity. Her narrative also presents a powerful challenge to our modern conceptions of legacy. In an era obsessed with personal branding and curated online identities, Alva's story asks us to look beyond the superficial markers of success. She could have been remembered for throwing the most extravagant parties or owning the most magnificent homes, achievements that would have filled the society pages of her day, but would have been largely forgotten by history. Instead, she chose a different kind of immortality. Her legacy is not etched in stone or recorded in the ledgers of a bank. It is woven into the fabric of countless lives that were uplifted because of her choices. It lives on in the generations of women who gained an education and a political voice, in the families who found health and safe shelter, and in the very principle that philanthropy can be a courageous force for challenging power, not just a band-aid for its wounds. She proved that the most enduring legacy is not what you build for your own name, but what you help others build for themselves. As we reflect on this incredible tale of transformation, it inevitably turns the mirror back on us. While few of us will ever face the dilemma of what to do with a Vanderbilt-sized fortune, every one of us possesses resources of our own, be it time, talent, attention, or whatever measure of wealth we have, and we all make daily choices about how to use them. Alva's life is not a prescription to give everything away, but an invitation to a more conscious and examined life. It asks us to consider the alignment between our resources and our values. Are we using what we have in a way that merely insulates us from the world's problems? Or are we deploying it in whatever way we can to be part of the solution? Her story encourages us to think critically about the legacy we are building right now with the choices we make every single day. What mark do we wish to leave on our communities, on our families, on the world? Will it be a footprint of consumption or a blueprint for a better future? In the final analysis, Alva Vanderbilt Belmont's journey from guaranteed luxury to purposeful sacrifice stands as a timeless testament to the power of a single conscience to ignite monumental change. She was a woman who looked upon the gilded world she was born into and dared to imagine a more beautiful one, then spent her life and her fortune to make that vision a reality. Her story is a beacon, reminding us that our greatest privilege is not what we have, but what we choose to do with it. So as you move forward from this story, carry its central question with you. In your own life, with your own unique resources and circumstances, what kind of world will you choose to build?